Hello everyone. In this video, I'll be discussing with you on defense mechanism. I'm Rima Stanley, tutor at Triple M College of Nursing. So at the end of this video, you'll be able to know what is the definition of defense mechanism, the purpose of defense mechanism, the classification with explanation of different defense mechanism with its examples. So defense mechanisms is broadly categorized into bodily defense mechanisms and ego defense mechanisms. If you remember in the last video, I discussed about coping and adaptation where I said about a physiological response of the body to stress is an example of bodily defense mechanisms, while ego defense mechanisms is what we are going to discuss today. So, to begin with, coping is a way one adapts to a stressor physiologically, physically, psychologically, and behaviorally. Ego usually copes with anxiety through rational means. When anxiety is too painful, the individual copes by using defense mechanisms to protect ego and diminish anxiety. Sigmund Freud in 1904 used this term defense mechanism to refer to the unconscious process that defends or protects a person against anxiety, shame, loss of self-esteem, conflict, or unacceptable feelings. According to Freud, when id is in a serious conflict with ego and superego, the individual suffer from tension or anxiety. Defense mechanism basically enables a person to resolve conflicts and reduce the stress and anxiety. Usually, all these defense mechanisms are operated at unconscious level, and most of the defense mechanisms are deceptive in nature. So now let us see what is the definitions of defense mechanism. So it is a pattern of adjustment through which an individual relieves anxiety caused by an uncomfortable situation that threatens self-esteem. Other ways, in a simple way, we can explain this as a method by which a person tries to attempt in order to protect self and cope with his basic drives or emotional painful thoughts, feelings, or events. So when these defense mechanisms are used moderately, they are harmless, but when it is excessive and persistent use of this defense mechanism, it becomes harmful. So what is the main purpose of defense mechanism is mainly to reduce anxiety and to eliminate anxiety when it is used in a lesser amount. Now let us see what is the classification of defense mechanism. So these are mainly classified according to its results, that is positive defense mechanisms and negative defense mechanisms, where examples of positive defense mechanisms are compensation, substitution, sublimation, rationalization, repression, undoing, identification, transference, intellectualization, and introjection. And negative defense mechanisms examples are suppression, displacement, projection, regression, fixation, fantasy, reaction formation, conversion, dissociation, and denial. So in the next slide, we'll be seeing the explanation of each of these types of defense mechanisms with its example. So the first one is compensation. So compensation is a pattern by which tension or anxiety is relieved by an individual make up for a personal weakness. For example, a student who failed in his studies may compensate by becoming the college champion in athletics, or a plain girl who cannot compete with her more beautiful sisters may compensate by studying hard and become first in the class. So these are consciously covering up for a weakness by emphasizing or making up for a desirable traits. Next one is substitution. So it's a mechanism by which tension or anxiety is reduced by replacing the unachievable goals with achievable goals. For example, a student who has not been able to get admission to MBBS course may try to substitute it with a course such as physiotherapy or nursing. Another example where a person aspired to become a national level cricket player who has not been selected, he may try to substitute his goal by being a coach at a college level. So now let us see what is sublimation. So sublimation is consciously or unconsciously channelizing instinctual drives into acceptable activities. So it is a mechanism that causes channelizing of socially unacceptable desires into acceptable form. So in this mechanism, primitive impulses are transferred or directed to a socially useful goals. For example, a teenage boy with a strong competitive and aggressive feelings become a football player, or a young man who has lost his lover may turn to write poetry about love. Or another example, a person who has aggressive feeling and cannot express in society can become a soldier or a boxer. Now let us see what is rationalization. So it's a process in which an individual justifies his failure and socially unacceptable behavior by giving socially approved reasons. Uh, for example, also it's a defense mechanism in which an individual justifies his failures and socially unacceptable feelings and behaviors by making excuses or formulate logical reasons or socially approved reasons. Examples are like a husband who does not enjoy the company of his wife outside the home and usually leaves his wife at home. He may give a logic reason saying that his wife is socially shy, or a girl who fails to get admission for nursing course may point out a number of difficulties of nursing profession, or a person without a vehicle says that he does not want to risk his life by driving. Another example, a student who failed in the examination may complain that the hostel atmosphere is not favorable and has resulted in his failure, are all example of rationalization, that is giving justification or reasons for on failure. Now let us see what is repression. This is unconscious and involuntary forgetting of painful ideas, events and conflicts. For example, is forgetting a loved one's birthday after a fight. So, regression is a process of unconscious forgetfulness of our unpleasant experiences. So, it's the involuntary blocking of unpleasant feelings and experiences from one's awareness. I'll give you another example, that is, a man is jealous of his good friend's success but is unaware of his feeling of jealousy is an example of repression. Now let us see what is undoing. So this is consciously doing something to counteract or make up for a transgression or wrongdoing, or is the act symbolically canceling or revising or reversing out a previous act which is unacceptable. For example, giving a gift to a child who is being punished for a wrongdoing, or a daughter shouts at her father as there is no petrol in the car and is getting late for office, brings a favorite film for her father to watch. So, this is an example of undoing her behavior of shouting and then bringing a film. Now, let us see what is identification. Through this process, an individual attempts to increase self-worth by acquiring certain attributes and characteristics of another individual one admires. So it plays a very large part in the development of personality, and in this, individual feels personal satisfaction in the success and achievement of another group or a person. For example, the young son of a famous civil rights worker adopts his father's attributes and behavior with his with the intent of pursuing similar aspiration, or an illiterate father often takes his son's higher education as his own achievement is an example of identification. Now let us see what is transference. So in transference, the image of one person is unconsciously identified with that of another. For example, a patient who is fond of his daughter finds the nurse of the same age and height as his daughter. So he transfers his positive emotions to the nurse as his daughter. Now, it can also possibly that if he dislikes his daughter, he transfers his negative emotions to the nurse by being rude, abusive, or aggressive without any cause. Now, let us see what is intellectualization. So, this is a separation of the emotion of a painful events or situations from the fact involved, and acknowledging the fact but not the emotion. So it's an attempt to avoid expressing actual emotion associated with a stressful situation by using the intellectual process of logic, reasoning, and analysis. For example, a young professor who receives a letter from his fiancée breaking off their engagement, he shows no emotions when discussing this with his best friend. Instead, he analyzes his fiance's behavior and tries to reason why the relationship failed. Is an example of intellectualization. Now let us see what is introjection. So in introjection, the values and characteristics of a significant person are incorporated in one's personality. So for example, a woman who likes to live in a simple way introjects in her the sophisticated way of living likes her husband. Now let us see suppression. So, suppression is the voluntary blocking of unpleasant feelings and experiences from one's awareness to avoid discomfort and anxiety. For example, a student uh, consciously decide not to think about her insult in examination hall so that he can study effectively. Or another example, a person may refuse to consider his difficulties by saying that he does not want to talk about it. Is an example of defense mechanisms. Now let us see what is displacement. So displacement is unconsciously discharging pent-up feelings to a less threatening objects. So in this defense mechanism, the emotional feelings is transferred to a person or object who are less dangerous than those who initially aroused the emotion. So an individual who is using displacement is unaware of this at the time, but later he can realize it. For example, um, a husband comes home after a bad day at work and yells at his wife, or a person who is angry with his boss but cannot show it. Yeah, okay, he cannot show it to his boss but then shows to his wife is an example of displacement. Now let us see what is projection. So Projection is unconsciously or consciously blaming someone else for one's difficulty. So, placing blame for own difficulties upon others means projection. Here, others are seen as responsible for own mistake, and one's own unacceptable feelings and thoughts are expressed as they are due to others. For example, a person who blames another for his own mistake is using projection mechanism, where a surgeon whose patient does not respond as he anticipated may tend to blame the theater nurse who helped the surgeon at the time of operation, or a business person who values punctuality is late for a meeting and states that, sorry, I'm late. My assistant forgot to remind me of the time, is an example of projection. Now, overuse of these often can lead like fails to learn, to take personal responsibility and may develop into delusional tendencies. Now let us see regression. So this is unconscious return to an earlier and more comfortable developmental level. It means an immature way of responding to a stress or go backwards. So in this, the adult revert back to an earlier developmental level in order to deal with the reality. An individual, thus less mature form of behavior when faced with difficulties, where he finds less conflicts, hence less anxiety. So adults too may regress to the oral stage of development and suck their thumb when life gets stressful. So example of regression is a nurse makes an error in giving medication and starts crying. Or another example, a person who is depressed may withdraw to his or her own room, curls up in a fetal position on the bed. It's all example of regression. Now let us see what is fixation. So fixation refers to a point in the individual's development at which certain aspects of the emotional development do not advance. Example, thumb sucking continuously till adult age. Unmarried middle-aged man still depends on his mother to provide his basic needs are all example of fixation. Now let us see what is fantasy. Fantasy is used to gratify frustrated desires by imaginary achievements and wishful thinking. So the tendency of daydreaming is most common during adolescence. Uh, One example of this is a young boy who could not help his ailing father due to shortage of money daydreams that he has got a lot of money from lottery ticket and his father, mother and family members has best of all the facilities of everything is an example of fantasy. Now let us see what is reaction formation. So this is replacing unacceptable feelings with their exact opposites. In this defense mechanism, the unacceptable real feelings are replaced and acceptable opposite feelings are being expressed. So it is defined as the unconscious transformation of unacceptable impulses into exactly opposite attitudes, impulses, feelings, or behavior. So, example is a jealous boy who hates his elder brother may show him exaggerated respect and affection towards him. Or another example, a woman who actually dislikes her mother in law hides her feelings by being always nice to her. Now let us see what is conversion. So this is the unconscious expression of intrapsychic conflicts symbolically through physical symptoms. So in this pattern of defense mechanism, strong emotional conflicts which are not expressed are converted into physical symptoms. And it has two benefits for the person. Mainly, it helps to resolve conflict. It brings him a great deal of attention and sympathy. So, example, a student, a nurse who is very anxious about her examination may develop a headache. Is an example of conversion. Now, let us see what is dissociation. Uh, the unconscious separation of painful feelings and emotions from an unacceptable idea, situations, or object is called as dissociation. So, example is partial amnesia or amnesia that prevents a recall of a previous day's accident, or adults who remembers nothing of a childhood sexual abuse is an example of dissociation. Now, overuse of this can lead to dissociative disorders. Now let us see what is denial. So this is the unconscious refusal to admit an unacceptable ideas or behavior. Usually the first, one of the first defense mechanism which is learned and used. So denial is nothing but where any individual refuses to face the reality. So it protects the individual actually from shock of reality, and they unconsciously use this, and this reaction is usually for some time. Now, denial is quite harmless if practiced in moderation, but can lead to a serious difficulties in health and lifestyle if practiced in excess. Example is when some very near and dear one die in the family, some people say no, he's still alive. Or another example I shall give you, where the mother of a child who is fatally ill may refuse to admit that there is anything wrong, even though she is fully informed of the diagnosis and expected outcomes. So it is because she cannot tolerate the pain that acknowledging reality would produce. So overuse of this mechanism, again, it can lead to repression, dissociative disorders, etc. Now, most of these defense mechanisms, when it is used in limited form, it is definitely useful. However, if it is used in excess, then it is harmful. So with this, we have come to the end of the session. So the keynotes are defense mechanisms are behaviors people use to separate themselves from unpleasant events, actions, or thoughts. These are psychological strategies that help the people to distance from threat and unwanted feelings such as guilt and shame. Like I said, overuse of defense mechanisms become ineffective and can lead to a breakdown of personality. So these contents are taken from Srivani, A Guide to Mental Health and Psychiatric Nursing, positivepsychology.com, psychologytoday.com, and webmed.com. Thank you for watching this video.